What if death is not really the end, but the beginning of a dangerous path, where every step decides your fate for eternity? The ancient Egyptians believed that after the last breath, the soul goes on a journey full of traps, courts, and demons, and only one text could become its only protection. The Book of the Dead is not a myth or a legend. It is a real guide to the afterlife, written with the blood of faith and the fear of eternal disappearance. In this episode, you will learn why the Egyptians built giant tombs not for the body, but for the soul, and there will also be a lot of interesting things. Stay with us until the end, and you will see not just an ancient text, but a map of salvation, where each line can be the last hope for immortality. Among the sands left by the great river, and under the oppression of the scorching sun of Egypt, not only earthly power was born, but also the idea that death is not the end, but only the first step into another reality. No people in history took the last path as seriously as the ancient Egyptians, and therefore their burial complexes were not just symbols of power. They served as portals through which the soul passed into the realm of eternity. The majestic pyramids not only defied time, but were also conceived as shields, protective shells that contained not the body, but the eternal hope that the soul will not be forgotten and will not go astray in a world where the sun does not shine, but the law still exists. Every day of an Egyptian's life was spent preparing for this moment, the journey after his last breath. And while material treasures and carefully planned tombs provided protection for the body, the main support of the soul was a secret text not intended for the eyes of the living. It was called the Chapters of the Daylight Exit, although it later became known as the Book of the Dead. This text was more than a collection of prayers. It was a map. It was a weapon. It was a judgment. Each copy of the book was personally compiled for the deceased, taking into account his name, lineage, achievements, fears, and hopes, and accompanied him from his last breath to his final judgment. The Egyptians believed that there were no guides in the afterlife. No one would take the soul by the hand. There were no teachers. The only ally was memory, the memory of spells, rituals, and amulets learned during life that could protect against demons, pass through gates, and avoid traps. On every funerary object, from golden masks to the inside of the sarcophagus, fragments of this book were written, as if the very substance of the dead's reality was filled with knowledge. But the most terrible thing was not the path through the labyrinths of the afterlife. The most decisive moment was the truth, the ceremony of weighing the heart, where 42 gods, judges stood, where Osiris watched from the darkness, and Mot held her feather of truth. Something happened for which they had been preparing their entire lives. The heart of the deceased was placed on the scales opposite the feather of truth. If the heart was light, not burdened by lies, evil, betrayal, the soul gained immortality. But if it pulled down, there was no forgiveness. The soul was devoured by Amit, a monster from the three elements, born for the final reckoning. Neither the world of the dead nor the world of the living existed for it anymore. Therefore, for the Egyptians, the Book of the Dead was not a magical text. It was an act of resistance to oblivion, an attempt to overcome the nature of time and deceive the force that awaits everyone on the threshold of the last path. And this was their tragic but majestic belief, that death can be bypassed if you are better prepared for it than for life. Tibet, Song of Bardo, passage through fear, high in the mountains, where the breath is taken away from lack of air, and the eternal snows reflect a light that can blind the soul, one of the most subtle and profound concepts of death was born. For the Tibetans, the end of life was never a line. It was a moment of stratification, when everything that seemed real disappeared, leaving consciousness alone with its true nature. They did not look for gates, did not build tombs. They prepared for death as a state lasting 49 days, in the space between the worlds, in the Bardo. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Bardo Thodol, was not a prayer but an instruction manual. It was not intended for the living, but not for the dead in the traditional sense either. It was addressed to those caught in between. It accompanied the soul that could no longer return, but could not yet leave. There were no demons. There were no gods to judge or reward. There were only images arising from memory, and each of them was born of the deceased himself. Visions of bright deities are a reminder of compassion. Visions of wrath are a reflection of unrepentant deeds. Each week in Bardo is like a mirror. In the first, the soul met shining figures, embodiments of wisdom. But if it was afraid of the light, it was drawn to images of horror. In the second, distortions began. The stronger the attachment to the body, to the world, the more terrible the visions became. And the more the soul denied what was happening, the deeper it sank into illusion. No force could save it if it itself did not recognize the truth. But the Tibetans did not leave the souls alone. From the very moment of death, relatives began to recite the lines of the Bardo Thodol aloud, every day, for 49 days, as if their voice, penetrating the boundaries of the worlds, could remind the soul of who it was and who it could become. They believed that the compassion of the living eases the path of the deceased. That prayer is a rope thrown into the abyss, by which one can climb out if there is enough faith and love in it. Death in Tibetan culture is not the end of the body, but a test of consciousness. And if the soul went through this path, realizing that everything that happened was only the shadows of its fear and hope, it could be reborn at a higher level. But if it was carried away by illusions, if no one called it by name, did not remind it of good deeds, it could fall into the lower worlds, into a cycle of suffering without beginning or end. Bardo Thodol is not a book about the afterlife. It is a book about the moment of truth, where roles, names, desires, and bodies disappear. Only what you have always carried within you remains. That is why Tibetans taught not to avoid fear, but to go through it, because only the one who does not renounce the light even in the darkness can pass through Bardo and not get lost forever. Antarctica, egg from silence, discovery that changed the past, where no human had set foot for millions of years, amidst winds that scorched all living things, and under an ice sheet hundreds of meters thick, the world held its ancient secret. Antarctica, this seemingly empty and motionless continent, once revealed something that challenged all paleontology. In 2011, a group of researchers studying the Antarctic coast came across an object whose appearance defied all conventional classifications. It was a strange, wrinkled mass that at first glance resembled a deflated leather ball, but its organic texture and density immediately aroused suspicion. There was something different here. The object's size, about 28 centimeters long and 18 wide, made it too big to be a typical egg and too soft to be any known fossil. Scientists were baffled. It was sent to Chile's National Museum of Natural History, where it was largely forgotten. Almost a decade passed. The object gathered dust in its vaults until a team from the University of Texas decided to re-examine it in 2020, using modern scanning and analysis technology. The result shocked everyone. It was an egg, but no ordinary one. The shell, amazingly thin and soft, was the largest of any fossil of its kind ever found. This wasn't just a find, it was a breakthrough. Scientists determined that the egg belonged to a marine reptile that lived more than 66 million years ago. Most likely a mosasaur or pliosaur, ancient predators whose strength and size made them rulers of the Cretaceous oceans. Until this discovery, it was thought that such creatures gave birth to live young, like modern dolphins. No previously known fossils had ever suggested egg-laying, but now that theory has been shattered. It turns out that the Cretaceous ocean monsters may have left the depths to lay their eggs on the coast, where the sand and warmth would help the young hatch. Or, even more astonishingly, they may have done so in the water, like modern sea snakes, with amazing anatomical adaptations to the process. The theory was reinforced by another discovery. The bones of baby mosasaurs were found in the same area. This meant that the coast was a nesting site, possibly for an entire population of these creatures. A world that was thought to be long gone suddenly began to speak. And this egg, so inconspicuous from the outside, turned out to be a door to understanding the mechanisms of reproduction of creatures that lived long before dinosaurs, long before humans. It destroyed the boundaries between guesses and reality, between the known and the forbidden, between the past and what is not yet fully understood. The thing found under the eternal Antarctic ice became a symbol of the fact that there are still artifacts on the planet that are capable of not just supplementing the scientific picture, but completely rewriting it. Ancient Greece, the afterlife quarters of memory. When the sunset falls over the Aegean Sea and its light touches the remains of marble columns left over from former temples, you can feel how deeply the ancient Greeks felt life and death. For them, the afterlife was not an abstraction. It was a place with geography, laws, and architecture. It was a kingdom of shadows, divided not into good and evil, but into memory and oblivion. What you did in life, how your loved ones remembered you, determined your eternal destiny. The Greeks divided the afterlife into three key spheres. In the very center was Elysium, a bright valley where eternal spring reigned. People got there not by the grace of the gods, but for their exploits, glory, and loyalty to duty. Only heroes, philosophers, and outstanding people were honored with this fate. There was no pain, no aging, no fear. It was not just a place of reward, but the embodiment of an ideal, to live in such a way that after death one would continue to walk among the greats. But most souls ended up in the asphodel meadows. These lands were gray, dull, like a dream without content. Here souls drifted without emotions, memories, desires. They did not suffer, but they did not rejoice either. They existed. Asphodel was a realm of oblivion, a kind of limbo, where forgotten souls lost their name, dissolved into infinity. And then there was Tartarus, a place of punishment, not like hell, filled with fire and devils, but like a bottomless abyss into which fell those whose lives were burdened with violence, lies, and betrayal. Tartarus did not simply torment, it reflected. Souls suffered not so much from punishments as from the contemplation of their own past, endlessly repeated and inexorably clear. Sisyphus, endlessly rolling his stone, is not just a symbol of suffering, but an image of senseless stubbornness born of pride. The ancient Greeks believed that fate after death depended not on the gods, but on memory. If someone remembered your deeds, if your words lived in the minds of descendants, you continued to exist. Epitaphs were not simple inscriptions, but the last attempts to hold on to this world. Because if no one called you by name, you disappeared. For the Greeks, death did not cancel honor. Death opened the entrance to a space where only the essence of who you were was real. Therefore, heroism, nobility, and a great idea were not lofty concepts for them, but tickets to Elysium. To live with dignity meant not to be afraid of death, because everyone knew that there, beyond the river Styx, there are no judges, no redemption. There is only a reflection. You are as you have always been. China, ghosts that won't go away. Naihe Bridge and the debts of memory. As the first mists rise over the rice paddies and yellow lanterns light the night streets, something more than death comes alive in the consciousness of ancient China. Unlike other civilizations, the Chinese afterlife was not a clearly structured model of heaven and hell. It was an extension of the earthly one, with debts, obligations, memories, and consequences from which there was no escape. Here, death did not mean the end. It opened up the possibility of staying, and not always by choice. The ancient Chinese believed that the soul could remain in this world without finding peace. Restless spirits, ghosts, gou, could be angry, sad, vengeful, or lost. They arose when a person died suddenly, was forgotten, betrayed, or when burial rites were violated. Chinese culture did not simply fear these ghosts. It lived alongside them, recognized their power, and tried to appease them, support them, beg for forgiveness, or release them with honor. The central image of this afterlife geography was the Naihe Bridge, the passage that every soul must pass through to reach the world of the dead. But not every soul could do so. Souls whose lives were righteous and full of good deeds crossed the bridge and moved on. But those who sinned, offended, betrayed, fell from the bridge into the depths of hell. And hell itself, in Chinese tradition, consisted of 18 levels, each of which was associated with a specific crime and punishment, so detailed that it seemed not a myth, but a legal code. The most terrible thing for the Chinese was not punishment, but oblivion. If you are not remembered, you become a wandering spirit. If your tombstone is abandoned, you return at night. Knock on the windows, watch for descendants. If the family did not perform the proper ritual, did not make sacrifices, did not light incense, the spirit cannot leave. This is not revenge, but pain, a craving for home, for voices, for the light that was left behind. There were also special ghosts, water ghosts. These were the souls of the drowned, whose bodies were not found, and therefore were not buried. They became especially dangerous because they were looking for a replacement, a body through which they could return to the world of the living. The fear of them was so great that in some regions it was even forbidden to sing near water, so as not to attract their attention. But behind the fear was something deeper, a belief in the connection between generations. For the Chinese, the dead do not disappear. They watch, they advise, support, sometimes punish if descendants deviate from duty. The memory of ancestors was not a tradition, but the basis of the social fabric itself. So, on festival days, the streets filled with smoke from paper offerings, gold, clothes, houses, all made of paper, but with a real belief that in the next world it takes shape. The afterlife of China is not just a place. It is a mirror image of the world of the living, where everything that we did not manage to complete continues. It is a space in which the laws of time do not apply, but honor, duty, and respect still reign. And that is why in Chinese culture, the dead never leave. They live nearby, in the breath of the wind, in the faded light of a lantern, in the voice that is heard at midnight. North American plains, Blackfoot and Cheyenne retreat to sand hills. Where the earth seems endless, where the sky knows no bounds, and the wind sings through the tall prairie grasses, the ancient tribes of North America created their own special understanding of death and eternity. For the Blackfoot and Cheyenne people, leaving life was not a tragedy, not fear, and not punishment. It was a continuation of the path, and this path, like life itself, was closely connected with the land, with nature, with the spirits that accompanied a person from birth and did not leave even after the last breath. The Blackfoots believed that the soul of the deceased went to the east, to the sand hills. These were not gloomy lands or impenetrable forests. It was a bright, calm land where there was no judgment, pain, or regret. There were no punishing gods. No proof of worthiness was required. The soul got there if it was released correctly, with respect, without attachment. Therefore, the body of the deceased was not buried in the ground, not hidden. It was raised, placed on a high tree so that birds, sun, and wind could free the flesh from the earthly. Thus the soul rose more easily. Thus the connection with nature was not broken, it was completed. The Blackfoots believed that if the camp remained near the body, the soul might not leave. So, as soon as someone died, the entire settlement rose up and left. This was not an escape, but an act of kindness, so as not to keep the spirit on earth. The property of the deceased was distributed among his relatives, not as an inheritance, but as a final favor. This helped to sever the connection between the deceased and things, between the soul and the world of the living. The Cheyenne saw death as a temporary separation. For the first 4 days after passing, the soul remained close to the family. They felt its presence, sensed its gaze, heard its whispers. These were sacred days, a time when the living could say goodbye, tell all that was unsaid, silently forgive, or be forgiven. On the 5th day, the soul began its journey along the Milky Way, the road that led to Xi'an, the place where the spirits of the ancestors lived. Xi'an was neither paradise nor punishment. It was home, the home of everyone who had ever lived. There was no fear there. There was waiting. But even after the transition, the soul could return, in dreams, in visions, in signs. The Cheyenne believed that the dead come when they need support, warning, and instruction. They were not enemies of the living. They were a part of them. This connection was not interrupted. It only changed form. For the Plains tribes, death was not a loss, but a return to the circle in which everything has its place, in which the past and the future are not opposites, but one flow. They did not build tombs, did not write books, but their understanding of life and death was as profound as that of the most ancient civilizations. For they heard the voice of the earth, and they believed that beyond life there is only one thing: the movement of the wind, the rustling of the grass, and the path to the sandhills, from where everything begins anew. Ancient Persia, towers of silence, and the religion of fire. Among the harsh plains and sun-scorched mountains of ancient Persia, one of the most influential and mysterious religions of mankind was born: Zoroastrianism. It appeared long before the Islamic and Christian eras, and became the first religion known to the world that recognized the struggle between good and evil as a universal law of existence. At the center of the Zoroastrian faith was Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order. But for Zoroastrians, it was important not only what they believed in, but also how they died, and most importantly, how they returned to nature. They did not bury their dead. They did not burn bodies on fires. They believed that the earth was sacred, as was fire, and nothing dead should desecrate these elements. For them, a corpse was a carrier of pollution, a carrier of darkness that should not touch the pure. Therefore, the bodies of the dead were placed on the tops of special towers, towers of silence. These round stone structures were built on remote hills, far from settlements, where the wind was strong and the sky was open. When a person died, his body was not hidden. It was carried to the top of the tower and left there, open to the sky, the sun, and flocks of vultures. These birds were considered sacred. They were the cleansing forces that carried the flesh into the sky. The body decomposed quickly. The sun burned, the wind dried, the bones remained white and clean. After this, they were collected and lowered into a deep well in the center of the tower, where they continued to decompose, touching neither earth nor fire. Only the air, the element of transition, received them. This ritual was not cruelty, but the last act of respect. So Zoroastrians believed the soul can be purified only when its body is completely given to the world, when nothing remains of attachment. Only then could the soul continue its path to the light. But if the body was buried or burned, the elements were polluted, order was violated, and the spirit could be caught between worlds, deprived of peace and rest. Zoroastrians believed in judgment after death. The soul crossed a narrow bridge, Chinvat. If it lived righteously, the bridge seemed wide and led to the house of song. If not, the bridge became sharper than a blade, and the soul fell into the abyss of darkness. But even then, it had a chance. Zoroastrianism gave the possibility of redemption, faith in the victory of good in everyone, even the fallen. Today, the tradition of the Towers of Silence has almost disappeared. Climate change, urbanization, the disappearance of vultures made the ritual impossible. Many Zoroastrian communities were forced to seek alternatives, cremation, burial in hermetic sarcophagi. But even now, somewhere in Iran or India, under the starry sky, a lonely tower of silence still stands. It is silent, but its walls remember how the body, not buried in the earth, merges with the sky, and how the soul, freed from the flesh, rises to the light from whence it came. Scandinavia, Valhalla, Folkvang, and the restless dead of the Vikings. Where the cold winds bear the rocks and the northern seas rage as if alive, a people was born for whom death was not the end, but glory. The Vikings, the stern inhabitants of the north, did not seek to avoid death, they sought it. For to them, death was a test, not of sin or mercy, but of courage. Only he who met the end with weapons in hand was worthy of entering Valhalla, the great hall of Odin. Valhalla is not heaven. It was a fortress with shining golden roofs, where warriors who died in battle fought in the arena every day. And every evening they feasted at an endless table, eating the meat of a boar that was resurrected every morning, and washing it down with honey flowing from the udder of a magic goat. It was a place for the chosen ones, those who were taken from the battlefield by the Valkyries, heavenly warriors who watched over the last moments of life. But there was another way. Those chosen by the goddess Freya found themselves in Folkvang, another kingdom, less warlike, but no less worthy. There lived those who had shown valor not only with their swords, but also with their hearts. It was a land of peace, where courage was combined with mercy, where warriors rested not in endless battle, but in the peace they deserved. However, not everyone had the honor of dying with a sword in their hand. Those who died not in battle, from illness, old age, or accident, went to hell, a kingdom of fog and cold. There was no torture or torment, but there was no light either. It was a land of grayness, without glory, without songs. But it was not a curse either. It was simply a continuation of existence in another form. Therefore, death from old age was not terrible, but it did not bring pride either. More dangerous was something else, souls that could not leave. The Vikings believed in Hugers, spirits of the dead who remained among the living. They could not leave the world because of unfinished business, dishonor, or improperly performed rituals. If the deceased was buried hastily, without honors, or if his body was desecrated, the soul could turn into a draugr. These restless dead rose from the mounds, terrifying villages, destroying fields, killing cattle, and even the living. They were not ghosts, they were physical beings, vengeful and powerful. So funerals were a community affair. Ships were burned, bodies were buried with weapons, with coins for hell, with the names of ancestors, anything to ensure that the dead were not left without a purpose. Because the Vikings knew, death is not a rest. It is only a way forward, and if you were not prepared for it, if you did not live with honor, did not meet your end in battle, or were not truly mourned, you could become something else, something that would return, something that would knock on the door. For the Vikings, death did not divide, it tested. And even in the afterlife, the same rules remained: courage, honor, name. Because if your name is forgotten, you have disappeared. But if it sounds around the fire, if songs are sung about you, if children call you ancestor, you live forever in the halls of Valhalla, among the ringing of swords and the flames of feasts. Rome, death as a spectacle and power through memory. In a world where empires were built not by the sword but by legislation, architecture, and spectacle, death, too, became part of the political theater. For the ancient Romans, the afterlife was not just an extension, it was a showcase. How a person died, how he was buried, and how he was remembered determined not only his place among the gods, but also the standing of his entire family in the eyes of society. Funerals were not acts of farewell, but acts of demonstration. Rich families organized grand processions. Musicians, torchbearers, relatives dressed in the togas of their ancestors walked along the streets. They carried wax masks of the dead, exact casts of their faces, and resurrected the voices of the past. These masks were not just decoration. They were put on the descendants, who portrayed the deceased, imitating their speech, gait, gestures, triumphs. In this way, the Romans recreated an entire dynasty, emphasizing that the death of one does not interrupt the line. On the contrary, it confirms it. Tombs were built along the roads leading into the city. This was not a gesture of luxury, but a form of affirmation. Even the dead had to be visible. Each tombstone told a story, of virtues, of exploits, of the laws that the deceased defended. Even in death, a Roman remained a citizen. His name, status, valor were recorded not for the gods, but for passers-by. For the poor, everything was more modest. Their ashes were placed in columbaria, common tombs with niches, like memory cells. But even there they left inscriptions, epitaphs, small vessels with aromas, everything to show that the person lived and was loved. No death was silent. Even on the cheapest slab, there were the words, "Not forgotten." The Romans believed in an underworld borrowed from the Greeks, with Tartarus for the wicked and Elysium for the valiant. But the most important thing for them was not punishment or reward. The most important thing was memory. Oblivion was considered the worst outcome. A soul that was not prayed for, remembered, or offered anything lost its right to exist. That is why the Romans practiced memorial feasts, a day when families gathered at the graves of their ancestors, ate, drank, and told stories. It was not grief, it was a duty to keep the dead alive. A special place in the culture of Rome was occupied by the cult of ancestors, manes. These were the spirits of the dead who lived in the house, protected descendants, and demanded respect. Their images were placed in special niches next to home altars. Each day began with an offering to the spirits of the house, a drop of wine, cakes, incense, because without their blessing, nothing would work out. Thus, death in Rome was not a break, but an entry into a structure that was respected even by the living. It did not make a person weak or gone. It made him a symbol, and a symbol, fixed in stone, in words, in ritual, remained part of the empire. Even when the body decomposed, the name continued to live on marble, in the voice of descendants, in cities still guarded by the dead. Stones and astronauts of antiquity, rock chronicles of Val Camonica. Away in the mountains of northern Italy, far from modern highways and city noise, lies a valley that seems to speak to you without words. Val Camonica is not just a gorge carved by glaciers. It is a stone chronicle covering 8,000 years of human history. More than 300,000 rock carvings cover the cliffs, and each of them is not an ornament, not a decoration, but a testimony, not a prayer, but a cry, or perhaps a warning. Among the simple scenes, hunting, birth, rituals, suddenly appear images that take your breath away. Figures in rounded helmets, holding tridents, surrounded by symbols that do not resemble any known writing. They are called ancient astronauts. Their images are frighteningly ordered, as if they were drawn not by people, but by witnesses. These figures do not look like shamans, warriors, or spirits. Their poses and equipment resemble not a myth, but a description, not a fantasy, but a fact. They appear thousands of years earlier than the first written cultures. They are found next to a symbol known as the Kamuna rose, an image of a palm open outwards. This sign is repeated on hundreds of rocks. It is found in South America, in Egypt, in other places where the memory of the past stubbornly clings to stone. Who were these Camuns, a people who left such a colossal visual chronicle, but not a single written document? Why does something suddenly burst into the images of simple scenes that violates the logic of their time? Were they the first observers of an extraterrestrial phenomenon? Or is this an encrypted myth that we interpret too literally? Some archaeologists argue that the helmets are merely stylized crowns or shamanic headdresses, that the tridents are attributes of power, that the circles around the heads are halos, like those of future Christian saints. But then why are these figures isolated from other images? Why do they appear not in ritual scenes, but as observers? There is a theory that the Kamunas were contactees, that their mission was to capture the contact, not in a song, not in a legend, but in a stone that cannot be faked, that will live as long as the mountains live. Maybe they did not understand anything, only repeated what they saw. Or maybe they understood more than we think, but could not convey it in words, only in line, carving, form. Today, Valcamonica is a World Heritage Site, an archaeological sanctuary. But for those who stand among these rocks, the feeling is different. This is not a museum. It is like a corridor between the past and something that will never be present. There, in the shade of the pines, where ancient astronauts still look at us from the cold stone slabs, everyone feels. Not all secrets were myths. Some were messages. And perhaps we still do not know how to read them. Himalayas, Iron Man from space. At the edge of inaccessible peaks, where Tibet meets the sky, there is a hidden story that no one took seriously for a long time. In 1938, a German expedition sent to Tibet on behalf of the Nazi leadership was supposed to look for evidence of Aryan origin. Instead, among the snowy plains, its participants discovered a statue that at first seemed simple, but with each passing year, it became clear. Before them was something much more than an artifact. The figure was small, about 24 centimeters in height, weighed almost 10 kilograms. It was called the Iron Man. But what made it truly unique was not its shape, but the material. The statue was carved from the rarest type of meteorite iron, a taxite rich in nickel and cobalt, with a characteristic density that no terrestrial ore can provide. This material cannot be processed with primitive tools. It is too hard, too dense. Its structure indicates an extraterrestrial origin. Moreover, its chemical composition coincides with the Chinga meteorite, which fell over Siberia and Mongolia about 15,000 years ago. The symbol engraved on the statue's belly caused even more controversy. It was a swastika, an ancient Indian sign symbolizing the sun, harmony, and the endless cycle of life. But in the context of the Nazi expedition, it acquired an alarming resonance. However, for the Tibetans, everything was different. The statue probably depicted Vikrapana, the thunder god, a warrior, protector associated with the energies of the cosmos. It was kept in one of the high mountain monasteries, or as part of the Bon culture, which preceded Buddhism. There, they believed that if an object fell from the sky, it was holy, and if it was carved from a star, it was the bearer of the will of the gods. The most amazing thing is that for decades, no one knew that this statue was made of a meteorite. It remained in private collections, hidden in archives, passed down as a magical relic. Only at the beginning of the 21st century, a group of scientists was able to conduct a spectral analysis, which confirmed the origin of the artifact. And then the debate began. How were the ancient craftsmen able to process the meteorite? Where did they get their tools? Or perhaps they did not process the metal. It already had the desired shape. Since then, the Iron Man statue has become an object of particular interest to historians, astronomers, and even ufologists. It seemed to be on the border of two realities, sacred and scientific. It was not just a thing that fell from the sky. It was a challenge to everything we think about the ancient world, and, perhaps, proof that heaven and earth were once closer to each other than we can imagine, that not all artifacts carry the memory of the past. Some bring it with them, from the future. Iran, the burnt city, and the woman with the eye of the future. Amid the dry, parched winds of eastern Iran, in the sands of the ancient city of Shar, Assault, lies a history that archaeology has long refused to recognize as exceptional. Known as the Burnt City, this city was one of the most important sites of the Bronze Age. And although it disappeared from the face of the earth 4,000 years ago, in 2006 something happened that forced us to rethink the boundaries of understanding in medicine, in crafts, and in our very concept of humanity. That archaeologists found the remains of an unusually tall woman, almost 1.80 meters in height, which in itself was an exception for that time. But the real shock was waiting in her eye socket, where, it seemed, nothing should have been preserved. There was not a trace, not a shadow, but a physical object, an artificial eye. It was not made of glass or metal. It was a mixture of natural bitumen and animal fat, a unique mass and structure that retained softness and shape. It did not simply fill the void. It moved with the turn of the head, imitating a living gaze. The most incredible thing is in the details. The iris and pupil were engraved with surgical precision. Tiny gold threads, thicker than a human hair, were inserted into the surface of the prosthesis to imitate blood vessels. This was not just an attribute. This was a restoration of the human form. Probably the eye was worn during life, and not placed in the tomb as a symbol. And this raises the question, who was this woman? Next to her, they found a mirror polished to a mirror-like smoothness. The finest ceramics, gold necklaces, and silver rings, all pointed to high status. Perhaps she was a priestess, perhaps a scholar, perhaps a ruler. In any case, this was not a random prosthesis. This was an artifact created to order, with a level of attention to detail that cannot be explained without a deep engineering culture. For archaeologists, this was a discovery comparable to a turning point in understanding the development of medicine. Before this, finds of artificial eyes were only symbols, ritual inserts into mummies. Here, however, was a functional organ, taking into account movement, symmetry, and aesthetics. It did not hide a defect, it emphasized dignity. This eye didn't just look, it saw, and perhaps it knew. The future would one day return for it. Today, it is kept in a museum, as a memory of a city burned by an unnamed fire. But the woman's gaze remains the same through the millennia, direct, firm, as if she were still alive, as if she knows that her artificial eye will one day be recognized not as a man-made detail, but as a harbinger of how far an ancient civilization could go in an effort to return man to his appearance and his dignity. Britain, Arthur Stone, and the memory of the king who was not. On the hills of the English countryside, among fields covered with fog, stands a block called Arthur's Stone. This is not just a massive boulder, it is a Neolithic tomb, built 3,000 years before the historical prototype of the legendary king appeared. But it is here, despite the obvious discrepancy in time, that history and myth merge, real archaeological traces and an eternal legend that cannot be proven and cannot be forgotten. King Arthur is a symbol of justice, nobility, courage. The story of him surrounded by the Knights of the Round Table, defending Britain from its enemies, conversing with Merlin, and receiving Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake has fueled the national imagination for centuries. But no one knows for sure if he existed. There is not a single confirmed historical document, not a single tomb, not a single manifesto that mentions him as a real person. All that exists is folklore, passed down by word of mouth, and places of power like Arthur's Stone. According to one version, it was here that Arthur fought the giant, and, having defeated him, he knocked the stone off its top, causing it to split. According to another legend, Arthur knelt in prayer at this stone, asking the gods to protect the land from invasion. There are indeed 2 indentations in the stone that resemble the marks of knees. This could be a coincidence, but in Britain, coincidences often become prophecies. Archaeologists confirm this place is ancient, monumental, and ritual. It was part of a burial complex. Ancestors were buried there, perhaps shamans, perhaps rulers. Massive stones, laid without cement, stand for millennia, resisting time, weather, and people. No one knows how they were installed, but everyone who stands nearby feels there is something here. It is not the noise of history that sounds here, but its echo. Arthur's Stone has become more than a ruin. It has become an anchor of myth. People come here not just for the scenery, but to feel the touch of something that existed beyond time. The legends of Arthur may be fiction, but if so, why do so many people feel his reality physically? Why does his memory live on in the scenery, in names, in rituals? Perhaps he did not live in the sense in which we want him to live, but he was born in the imagination of a people, and that is no less a powerful form of existence. And if Arthur is not a man, but an idea, then Arthur's Stone is not his grave, but his altar, an altar of memory that does not require proof, because, no matter how history changes, people will return to the place where someone once knelt. Even if these were not the knees of a king, these were the knees of faith. Oceania, Malden, an island without a name and temples without gods. In the very heart of the Pacific Ocean, far from shipping lanes, under the endless dome of the sky and surrounded by water, lies a small island. Its name is Malden. It belongs to the Republic of Kiribati, but even the locals rarely talk about it, because this piece of land, despite its modest size, carries a secret that has puzzled archaeologists and destroyed the certainty of what we know about Polynesia. There is no fresh water on the island, the soil is poor, the trees provide no shade, all the space is lifeless plains and sharp rocks. But it was here, on this inhospitable piece of land, that about 40 ancient temples were found, stone platforms made of massive blocks, arranged in geometrically precise lines, connected by stone roads leading to nowhere, or, perhaps, to the sea. Who built them is unknown. When exactly is impossible to determine. Not a single tribe in Kiribati, not a single oral tradition mentions the creators of these structures, no names, no myths, no legends. As if they were not people, or as if their time was so long ago that even the memory of them dissolved, like salt in water. The structures seem excessive for an island that could not have supported more than 100 or 200 people at a time. No food, no resources for a large-scale society. But the architecture suggests otherwise. The stones could not have been moved without coordination, without engineering design. The roads are paved with a precision not typical of nomadic or temporary settlements. Some scholars suggest that these temples were built by Polynesians, perhaps from other islands. Others have bold hypotheses, connections with Nan Madol, a megalithic complex in Micronesia, or even cultural crossovers with mysterious seafaring civilizations that existed before the advent of writing. However, there are no traces of exchange, no pottery, no remains, no signs, only stones, only roads leading into the ocean. The roads are the most ominous part. They stretch from the temples to the sea as if they were waiting for something. But there are no piers, no anchors, no traces of boats. Perhaps the water was lower once, and the island was larger. Or, on the contrary, the roads were built as a symbol, as a procession to the sea, to the horizon, where something sacred was to happen. Today, Malden is uninhabited. Its temples are silent. Their walls are coated with salt and time. Not a single written sign, not a single piece of evidence. Only geometry, repeating itself with frightening precision, as if nature itself was trying to leave a mark, or someone else, who left behind nothing but stone. Malden is more than just an archaeological mystery. It is a disturbing reminder that a civilization can disappear without a trace, without legends, without war, without songs, just disappear. And only the roads leading to the sea will tell you that someone was here, that someone believed, that someone was silent. Welshland, Haveford West, and the skeletons under the monastery. In the quiet town of Havford West, where ancient buildings keep the whisper of centuries, it seemed that nothing could disturb the provincial tranquility. But in 2022, when workers began demolishing the old shopping center, something was found under the concrete and asphalt that disturbed not only the soil, but also the very idea of the history of this place. Here, under the foundation of modern civilization, was hidden an ancient monastery belonging to the Dominican order. But the main discovery was waiting deeper, in the land where peace was disturbed by time. Archaeologists soon confirmed that this was the Priory of the Holy Savior, founded in the 13th century, and abandoned during the religious reform of the 16th century. Under the remains of the monastery, they found burials, numerous ones, almost 100 bodies. And what was initially perceived as an ordinary monastery necropolis turned out to be a terrible picture. A third of the remains belonged to children under 4 years old. There were too many children. Their bodies were scattered in disarray, without ritual, without respect, not a single sign indicating origin or belonging, just bones, covered by centuries of silence. A question arose that still has no answer. What happened in this monastery? Some researchers have suggested that this is the result of an epidemic, as perhaps an outbreak of plague or another deadly disease that struck a vulnerable part of the population. But then why are there so few traces of adults? Why was there no mass burial, as was customary in times of disaster? Why were the bodies of children hidden under the monastery and not in mass graves? Other historians have suggested a version of the tragedy. Perhaps the monastery served as a shelter for orphans or abandoned babies. Perhaps children were brought here in the hope of being saved, but they died of hunger, cold, or cruelty. Perhaps no one wanted their death, but no one stopped it. Or perhaps something darker was going on behind the priory walls. The closed orders of the Middle Ages could have become a refuge not only for faith, but also for rituals long erased from the annals. Some researchers cautiously mention possible purification rites, the practice of exorcism, or other spiritual procedures to which children were subjected. This has not been proven, but it has not been disproved either, and the monastery's silence only increases the anxiety. After the monastery was closed in the 16th century, its walls were destroyed, its foundations filled in, its memory erased. In its place, a modern shopping mall was built, a temple of consumption, literally built on bones. And only now, centuries later, has the city learned what lies beneath its feet. Halford West was a reminder that history doesn't disappear. It waits, under the ground, under the asphalt, under our homes, sometimes in the form of coins or frescoes, sometimes in the form of bones that speak without words. And each of those bodies, especially the children's, asks the question, who were they? Why did they die? Why so many, and so silently? There are no answers. There is only an excavation, and a feeling that does not go away, that the pain never disappears. It just freezes, under the monastery, under the city, under us. Eye of the Sahara, sand spiral, and the shadow of Atlantis. In the vast desert expanses of Mauritania, where dust rises in the wind and the horizon trembles in the heat, there is a structure hidden that cannot be seen from the ground. Only from the sky, from the height of a satellite or a pilot, does it become clear. In the very heart of the Sahara, there is a ring-shaped object, as if carved out of the very surface of the continent. This is the Eye of the Sahara, or Richat structure, a formation so huge that it has been used as a landmark for astronauts returning to Earth. From the air, it looks like a giant fingerprint, concentric rings extending into the sand, as if someone had placed their hand on the ground and left a mark. The diameter is almost 50 kilometers. The structure is too symmetrical to be an accident, and too old to be man-made. Scientists call it an erosion feature, caused by the uplift of a dome of the Earth's crust, subsequently eroded by water and wind. But not everyone agrees with this explanation. Some researchers, especially those who seek echoes of lost civilizations, point to a frightening coincidence: Plato's description of Atlantis. His texts speak of a city surrounded by alternating rings of water and land, of a powerful culture that disappeared in one day and one night. The geometry of the Eye of the Sahara matches. The proportions are almost identical. The size is consistent. But the most striking thing is the silence of history. There is not a single written mention of this place, as if it had been deliberately forgotten. Some geologists claim that a sea salt deposit has been found inside the structure, which may indicate that there was once water here, that the Sahara could have been different, blooming, alive, housing a great lake or even an inland sea. And then, catastrophe. The shift of plates, evaporation, drying out. And overnight, the civilization that existed on the banks of this water disappeared, leaving behind only a stone spiral. But even official science acknowledges the oddities. Ancient flint tools have been discovered in the center of Rishat. Primitive, but numerous, they lie on the surface, as if the people who lived here had left suddenly. No pottery, no remains of dwellings, no traces of irrigation systems, roads, or cemeteries. Only stone and handprints. However, mystics and those who search for forgotten codes in history do not abandon this place. They believe that the Eye of the Sahara is not a natural formation, but a remnant of something artificial, not necessarily of human origin. Perhaps it is a center of energy, perhaps a platform on which something larger than a city stood, or vice versa, a funnel, a trace of an impact that changed the climate, the relief, the time. The Eye of the Sahara lies in the desert, inaccessible to most, surrounded by silence. But it looks at the sky, and perhaps one day someone will again understand that this is not just a geological anomaly. It is a trace of memory, the memory of something that is gone, or of something that can return. Poland, Scythian saddle and forgotten warriors of Eurasia. Not far from the Vistula River, among the green hills and soft Polish earth, archaeologists were doing routine fieldwork when their metal detector suddenly rang, deep and alarming. Where nothing big was expected, the earth opened up and revealed a piece of history that could rewrite the map of ancient migrations. It wasn't a sword, a coin, or jewelry. It was a bronze saddle. The find, dating back to around 500 BC Cisco, immediately attracted attention. The saddle was made with astonishing precision. Thin sheets of bronze reinforced with metal cords, curved shapes that repeated the contours of the rider and animal. In terms of craftsmanship, it was not inferior to examples found in the steppes of Kazakhstan or in southern Russia, but here, in the very center of Europe, no one expected something like this. Next to the saddle, archaeologists found a Scythian battle axe. This type of weapon is recognizable: a symmetrical blade, massiveness, a sharp tail, intended not only for combat, but also for intimidation. Such a weapon was carried only by those who wielded it as an extension of their own hand, not recruits, veterans. The Scythians were a nomadic people whose military might and cultural influence spanned the steppes of Eurasia, from the Black Sea to the borders of China. They did not build cities, they built legends, on horseback, in motion, in gestures. They were feared, hired as mercenaries, admired. The Greeks wrote of them with respect and fear. But until now, it was believed that they rarely went so far west. This discovery changed everything. It proved that the Scythians did not simply come to Europe. They stayed, settled in, perhaps traded, perhaps fought. This saddle is not a random object, but an element of the infrastructure of nomadic life, necessary for long campaigns. It was not forgotten. It was used and buried according to the ritual, perhaps together with the dead rider, perhaps as a sign of the end of his journey. The Scythians did not write histories. All we know about them are excavations of burial mounds, remains of weapons, mysterious ornaments depicting scenes of hunting, battles, sacrifices. They believed in the passage of the soul, in the power of the horse as a guide to the afterlife. And a saddle left in the ground is not just an object, it is a key, a culture in which movement is more important than walls, where identity is not associated with a flag, but with a saddle, a bow, a shadow on the grass. The discovery in Poland is a reminder that borders in ancient times were not walls, but vectors. People moved, leaving behind metal, earth, blood. And somewhere under a layer of time, we still find traces of those who did not build empires, but moved faster than them, those who disappeared without a text, but left a bronze saddle as proof that even the wind can leave a trace. Iraq, Lagash Tavern, a taste of ancient life. In the shadow of Mesopotamia, where the morning sun of civilization first rose between the Tigris and Euphrates, lies Lagash, one of the most ancient cities of Sumer, whose history goes back 5,000 years. Temples, palaces, tablets with laws and prayers are found here. But in 2023, archaeologists stumbled upon something unexpected. This was not a royal burial, not a temple. It was a tavern, an open dining area, stone benches along the walls, a massive stove, a primitive refrigerator, Zaire, which was kept cool with the help of water. Everything was carefully arranged, with a clear logic of everyday life. This was not a ritual, it was life. And on ceramic bowls, archaeologists found traces of cooked fish, an ancient meal frozen in time. The word tavern may sound too modern for the Sumerians, but this was precisely the place where people gathered to eat, drink, and talk. Not kings, not priests, but ordinary city dwellers, workers, merchants, women with children. It was a space for human breathing, not myth, but everyday life. Here, for the first time, archaeologists felt not distance, but closeness. There was no grandeur in this place. There was warmth. The stone benches were polished not by time, but by bodies. The walls were covered with soot, traces of thousands of meals. Here, a few steps from temples and palaces, the Sumerians laughed, argued, discussed business, fell in love. The Tavern of Lagash destroyed the boundary between us and them. It reminded us, ancient people were not symbols. They were people. They did not simply build temples and write cuneiform. They ate hot fish, drank wine from clay cups, cursed at the noise, and admired the sunset over a flat roof. They lived, and in these details lies their authenticity. The discovery of the tavern also forced us to reconsider our view of social life in Sumerian cities. Usually, attention is paid to administrative buildings, temples, archives. But here, for the first time, the street of life was recorded. The space in which the soul of the city, its daily rhythm, lived. Archaeologists have found amphorae, scales, animal bones, and trade items nearby. All of this indicates that the tavern did more than just feed. It connected. It was a point of contact, a cultural hub. Here, treaties were made, alliances were broken, and music was played. Lagash has always been considered one of the cultural centers of the Sumerian civilization. But now, we know that it was also a human center. And what has been preserved under its layers is not only the remains of power, but also the imprints of simple happiness. The tavern in the center of the city is like a heart that continues to beat, even if the temple is already silent. And today, when we look at ancient bowls with the smell of fish, we understand, in essence, nothing has changed. Man is still looking for a place where he can be himself, where there are no altars and rules, only a table, food, conversation, and perhaps a piece of eternity in a bowl that has passed from hand to hand. Jerusalem, the ditch carved in stone, protection of the holy city. When it comes to cities that have survived centuries, battles, and empires, the name of Jerusalem always comes first. Not only three world religions meet here, but also thousands of years of conflict, faith, fear, and hope. But few people know that under the dust of centuries, Jerusalem hides a defensive system so ingenious that even modern engineers admit it was a masterpiece. We are talking about the moat, not a water-filled canal, like in European castles, but a dry, deep trap, hand-cut in limestone, encircling the old city. This ditch, in places more than 10 meters wide and almost 7 deep, was not just a barrier, it was a shield, created to slow down any attack. It turned an attempt at assault into vulnerability. The attackers found themselves below, under fire from the high walls, with no way to take cover. They lost speed, lost formation, and most importantly, they lost the initiative. Archaeologists from the Israel Antiquities Authority have found traces of this ditch at the Temple Gate, where the Crusade armies once marched. According to chronicles, it was this ditch that caused the Crusaders to need 5 grueling weeks to approach the walls of Jerusalem. They hauled logs, built embankments, pulled up siege towers, all in order to cross a pit that even an army could not jump over. But the moat was not the only line of defense. After it began the second line of defense, walls and secret passages, tunnels, through which defenders could appear in unexpected places. And even the boiling oil thrown from above was not from myths, but from chronicles. Everything worked as a single system. The city was a living being, protecting its heart. But there was more than just military logic hidden in that ditch carved into the rock. It was also a symbol that Jerusalem would not surrender, that faith could take the form of a wall, that the earth could become a weapon if you put your will into it. Modern archaeologists have had a hard time finding their way to the ditch, filled in for centuries, strewn with rubbish, hidden under roads and buildings. But once they opened it, it became clear, this is not just an architectural marvel. It is a trace of time. It is the imprint of a struggle in which not only armies are involved, but space itself. When we look at Jerusalem's moat today, we see more than just stone. We see fear and hope. We see the effort of thousands of hands cutting away at the rock. We hear the picks bouncing. We hear the rain falling. We hear the defenders praying. And we see the silence that followed victory or defeat. This ditch is a reminder that even in a religious conflict, architecture remains, the trace of an architect who did not know whose faith he was defending. He knew he was building for a city that could not be lost, because it is not just a temple, but a place where the silence of stone is louder than the cries of wars. China, fortress under the sand, the last guard of the Great Wall. Where the Great Wall of China disappears into the desert, as if dissolving in the sand, archaeologists have found a forgotten fragment of history. This is not a tower or an observation point. This is a fortress, built almost 5 centuries ago, hidden under layers of time, dust, and indifference. The find was made in Shaanxi province, in the Moose Desert, among sparse bushes and scattered boulders, a place where even the wind rarely reaches. Life was once in full swing here. The boots of soldiers thundered here. The fate of the border was decided here. The fortress dates back to the Ming Dynasty, a time when the Great Wall was not only a symbol of greatness, but also a line of survival. The empire was under constant threat of invasion from the north, and to protect the territory, a system of forts, signal towers, and garrisons was built along the wall. This fortress was one of these points, a stronghold designed to stop a surprise attack, intercept scouts, and store weapons and provisions. What makes this fortress unique is its state of preservation. The walls are still standing. The stone has cracked, but has not collapsed. The walls show traces of repairs made centuries later, as if several generations tried to preserve its shape. Inside the fortress, archaeologists have found incense burners, terracotta statues, remains of weapons, metal arrowheads. Everything suggests that this was a living military mechanism, not a symbol, but an active element of defense. But behind the strategy, there is something personal. Among the finds are painted potsherds with lines of poetry, calligraphy left by soldiers on the walls. These are letters home, memories of loved ones, poems written at night by the light of an oil lamp. There is no military bravado in these inscriptions. There is longing, there is anticipation, there is humanity. Layer after layer, archaeologists extracted from the sand the remains of the foundation, broken amphorae, animal bones. They found traces of everyday life, food, clothing, fragments of furniture, everything that shows people lived here. They did not expect heroism. They waited for news. They protected not only the empire, but also routine, order, home. The Moose Desert is silent. It took dozens of such fortifications, buried them for a time. But now, when one of the fortresses has seen the light again, it becomes clear. Behind the Great Wall was not only the border between civilization and barbarity. There was a fabric of life, people who lived on the edge, who did not strive for glory, who built walls so that others could sleep peacefully. This fortress is a reminder. Sometimes greatness lies not in size, but in endurance, in a stone that did not collapse, in centuries whose names no one remembers, but whose breath can still be heard in the cracks of the walls. This is the trace of people who remained unnoticed, but did the impossible. They held the border not with weapons, but with their presence, and that is why their fortress has survived both sand and time.